Welcome to Josiah White's training on termination. We will be looking at the discharge process, what that looks like through the termination of a chart or a case. There's guidelines we're going to hit, assessments, resources, documentation, and then we'll wrap up with how to go the extra mile in working with a family. We'll start with guidelines. So you've heard the case is going to close. Depending on how you heard the case is going to close, depends on maybe how you go about things. In a perfect world, we are able to hear that a case is going to close from the FCM. The FCM gives us plenty of time to begin wrapping up the case, getting closure with the family, and helping the family finish strong. Now, that's a perfect world. Now, you and I both know that this isn't a perfect world, and sometimes we hear a week later that the case closed, or maybe not a week, but a few days later that the case closed because of a removal. So today we're going to look at first some guidelines, some do's and don'ts. We'll start with the don'ts and just talk through some of that, and then we'll move into assessment. So some of the don'ts are, first of all, just because you heard the case is going to close, let's say the family told you, don't assume that the case is going to close. I would also say that with the FCM, if they mention it, not in front of the family, but if they mention it, that you also probably don't want to assume it's going to close until you get in writing, either through text or something like that, that the case is going to close. Our second don't is just because you heard, through the grapevine that the case is going to close, going to the family without DCS's permission and telling the family the case is going to close could be detrimental to the progress of the case, especially if the DCS FCM hasn't talked with their supervisor yet and gotten that full permission to close the case. The reason this could be detrimental is because once a family knows that the case is closing, we generally see them start to disengage from services. Now, there are some cases where a family will hear that the case is going to close, and these are very rare, but I have seen it where they hear the case is going to close, so they actually start to create problems so that we will stay in the home. So overall, don't tell the family the case is closing unless you get permission from DCS and the FCM. The last don't is not to underestimate the presence of grief. It very well could be there with the family as we're wrapping up services, but it also could be there for us as staff. And I myself have experienced this where a case closed because the client went to jail. And I felt like we had made a lot of progress and done a ton of work, especially through the Triple P parenting program. But the case closed and things were left undone. There's kind of this sense of an ambiguous loss that happens with some of the cases where it's a loss because of the relationship, but it's not like a loss as in a death, but the relationship does end. The other part of this is I would also say don't overestimate the presence of grief either. We've had times where we thought we had really good relationships with the family and the case closed and the staff reached out and didn't get any response. And the family didn't really want them coming by anymore for a visit, just to check in on them. And so that was kind of a shock to some of the staff because they thought they had built a relationship, but we are there for a purpose. And once that purpose is done, some families are done and working with us as well. On the do side for guidelines, there's a few. The first one is, and I've already mentioned it some, but do get the upcoming closing in writing via an email or a text and from the FCM and document that. That can be really helpful because then we can actually close the case out on our side instead of waiting for a referral that comes in with a closing date. Usually we have to have that closing date, and DCS sometimes has taken a week. I've seen it once they took a month to be able to get that closing referral to us. So for us to be able to close that out, we have to have that in writing. The second is do talk with the FCM. um, either informally or through a provider meeting to suggest a case closing as necessary. So if you feel like the case is done, you've completed all your work, we have no further safety concerns with the family, it's important to talk with that FCM and to suggest the case being closed. I would also say make sure you're ready to give a timeline of how long you need to create closure for the family. The next one is requesting a closing CFTM. We try to request an initial CFTM. We also want to see if we can do a closing one just to talk with the family together with all the providers at the table, discuss where they started with services and what's next for them, what's their goals. And that kind of leads you into that aftercare plan too. And then with that, you want to make sure you send that request to the FCM for the CFTM, document that request as well. And then our last do is certainly if you hear even wind, even if it's not true and you haven't confirmed it, even if you catch a rumor that the case is going to close, be sure to go in and do a discharge protective factor survey. It would be really good to just keep some of these on hand in your car just in case you hear about it and you're like, oh, let me go get one of those at the end of a session with a family, so that you can make sure we get those done. This is one of the weaker areas for us, is the actual completion of the protective factor survey. That wraps up just some simple guidelines when it comes to termination. Next, we'll move into assessment. Assessments picks us up where we left off with the protective factor survey. We'll look at that and we'll look at some other assessments as well. Just kind of some steps to be able to give you to best empower you in working with families. Let's look at some of those assessment steps today. Our first step is, again, completing the discharge protective factor survey. I wouldn't necessarily call it the discharge protective factor survey with the family, especially if we're not sure exactly if the case is going to close, but at least bringing that in. And usually this is the skills coach that completes this with the family. It's important to do the final protective factor survey, even if a quarterly one has been done recently, because this gives us the data for our PQI department to be able to pull and see over the course of the case, were we able to increase some of those areas from the protective factors survey. We want to see each of those areas overall grow, especially the total mean score. And so we're pulling that total mean score from the first one that's done quarterly, and then from the discharge protective factor survey. Without it, it really is hard to follow your progress with a case that you closed. And really, for each of us, it can be helpful to be able to look at the protective factor survey we did initially and then quarterly with the family to see if we ourselves have made progress. So for our own professional development, it can be helpful as well. What are you to do if this is unable to be complete? There's three main things that I would like you to do. The first is inform your supervisor that you're not able to complete it. Don't let your supervisor be surprised that it's been not completed, or the family refused, or things like that. The second thing that I would encourage you to do is to take a blank protective factor survey, and at the top of the assessment, write down the specific reason at the top of the assessment why you weren't able to complete it. If you just forgot to do the protective factor survey, we aren't able to take those that you forgot. Those will have to sit undone on the chart for a while before they drop off. But if we're able to write like the family outright refused, I wouldn't put outright, but if the family refused to complete the final protective factor survey, you can totally do that and put that at the top. Or you could say case closed abruptly due to removal, That might be a common one as well. So we're being specific at the top. You want to put the family's name, of course, and then your name, maybe initial it and put a date at the top of that form. Then you're going to submit that to your OA of your office, who will be able to put that into the chart so that it's not sitting under your late lists undone. For any other questions about the Protective Factors Survey, feel free to reach out to your supervisor or to your regional manager. They can give you some more information on that. The second step really on assessment is looking at other treatment assessments to measure outcomes. There are certain ones that we use. Specifically, we want to look at that depending on the reason for referral. For instance, if the primary reason for referral was substance use, then we'll probably want to do a SASI, the substance abuse assessment, at the beginning, and then do one at the end as well. For that final SASI therapist, you'll want to certainly change the time frame. I think normally it's 3 to 6 months on the SASI. You would want to put 1 or 3 months on that time frame. And what I mean by that is, in talking to the client, have them think about the last month of services that you worked with them when they're completing out the SASI. And that gives us a better idea of did we make progress in some of the intensity of symptoms? Did they become more normalized in the general population underneath some of those symptoms as well? A newer assessment that we're just rolling out is the PCL-5, and it's for trauma. This one they recommend doing monthly. So if you're using this one to follow trauma symptoms or working with PTSD therapists, this would be another good one to do at the very end as well, just to be able to you yourself and go back with the client and review the results, the outcomes of working with them. And then, of course, Triple P. So Triple P has a slew of assessments. We're certainly using the parenting scale. We're inputting that one to check our results. But there's also the Strengths Difficulties questionnaire that's pretty much going to be filled out for most every family with children. And so making sure that you bring in not only booklet 1 at the beginning for the parenting assessment, but you also bring in, if you're doing that, then it's very helpful to bring in booklet number 2, which is the same set of assessments. Those should be printed off and in your office hanging on the wall somewhere for you to be able to quickly grab and access those. And then we're going to look at booklet 2, and we're going to look at did things get better or not. And I would encourage you, especially with Triple P, to try and do that a week or two before your last session. And then when you go in for one of your final sessions, bringing those results, those outcomes back in, looking at the difference between booklet 1 assessments and booklet 2 with the family, so they can see if progress was made, and if not, what areas might we be able to refer them to for further services. And then with anything that is requested assessment-wise from DCS on the referral, we obviously want to make sure we do that assessment and working with the family. But then in doing so, submitting that to KidTracks for DCS and the court to have. That's why they're requesting it. And then at the end, when we do our second one, say it's the ending parenting assessment, for instance, we want to also put those results into KidTracks as well. So DCS has that bookended at the beginning of the shelf of the bookshelf, and then at the end, we want to bookend our assessments into KidTracks. All right. If you have any further questions about those, feel free to talk with your supervisor or your regional manager as well. Next, we're going to look at resources and how to best help a family connect with those resources. Resources really do depend on the reason for referral and the needs of the family, of course. Some of the resources that we're going to talk about are optional, depending on what treatment approach that you've been working with the family. Some we're going to have to do for pretty much every family. So let's look at some of the resources and the resource steps that are available to us in the termination process. The first is to think about a certificate. So making sure that you have some certificates printed off at the office, or at least knowing how to get to those in the Google Drive folder, family preservation folder. So depending on what EBP that they've taken, there are two that provide certificates of completion. The first one is Triple P. If they've been able to complete, I would say probably 8, 9, or 10 sessions of Triple P, then it would definitely be appropriate to go in, open up the Triple P certificate, and print it off for the family. I believe you may even be able to put in the family's name into the certificate when you print it off, or the parent's name. And there should be one for standard, and there should be one for teen for the Triple P program. The other one is Seeking Safety. Seeking Safety, as we've heard in previous training, it requires at least 6 sessions for it to be considered complete. And so looking at Seeking Safety and printing off a certificate of completion for the family or for the parent. Certificates can be helpful for the family, especially if they still have upcoming court, to be able to bring in and present to a judge to show physical evidence that they were able to complete that. The next step of resources would be the Community Advocacy Project, or CAP. That program, that evidence-based program, recommends a resource folder. This would generally be produced by the skills coach, the family skills coach. CAP recommends that as you go along with the family, that you develop a resource folder of the resources, at least the ones that you used and covered during the course of the case. And this resource folder can include the info, obviously, of the company, and the how-to. So it'd be like the phone numbers, the points of contact, and maybe even how to talk with the points of contact or that specific resource. And this is all in the spirit of empowering the individual that's in front of you, whose power has been stripped from them in the past. This could also be a virtual resource folder, maybe with a link that's texted to the client for a Google Doc that you developed over the course of the case, and you share that link with the client. And that is completely appropriate and an awesome way to be able to help clients, especially in the modern mobile era that we're in today. Feel free to use creativity here. CAP not recommends, but they say you could do a scrapbook format if you're creative. So us creative types, we might get into that and really love creating that together for the client, and then bringing that in and giving that to them at the end. And then near case closure, making sure we get that folder or that resource folder or that digital document to them somehow. Our second step really of the termination process here, and this is going to be at some point, is to complete the aftercare plan. And this can be done by the skills coach, the therapist, or both can have one depending on the goals that they were addressing. And really the aftercare plan is a look backward at where they started, and then a look forward at where they would like to go next as we wrap up services with them. It's similar to the treatment goals, taking time to look back with the family where they started and looking forward. But it's also brainstorming with the family ideas, and you can brainstorm ideas even before meeting with the family. You can collect phone numbers and call ahead for availability if you wanted to do a transfer to somewhere next if the family needs that. You certainly want to be specific on the aftercare plan, as specific as possible, listing phone numbers, contacts, and any other pertinent info. Denise, a former family specialist in family preservation who had about 18 to 20 plus years, I believe, in working with families, has recently told me that the aftercare plan, it's best to start it within the first month. So she would actually bring a blank copy of the aftercare plan with her into the first session, so that we're starting to talk about what the session, what wrap up looks like when we're all completely done with them, so that it's not a surprise. And then it's just kind of this developing aftercare plan through the course of the case. The next point here, and that could be very helpful, is attending a transfer meeting with further services. And the skills coach can do this, or the therapist. But the idea here is to create a soft transfer to further services. We can set up the appointments and we can attend that initial appointment with the family. An example would be you get an exchange of information for an aftercare service. You call, you set up the service, such as maybe with the Family Resource Center that's local to you. You coordinate the service with the FCM and the family. You can invite the FCM to attend with you and the family. You ask the FCM to call maybe and help speed up the availability of the appointment if they couldn't get you in very quick. And then you attend with the family. And then afterwards, you can even process with the family. Hey, how did that go? Do you feel like this is something that it could be helpful for you? Do you think you're going to be able to do it? What barriers might there be going forward? An example would be maybe taking a client past a counseling clinic to say, hey, there it is. Or, maybe even setting up an introduction. So there's all kinds of different ways to do a soft transfer is what we're talking about. But this is an area that most providers across the state say is weak for them. So it's worth taking some time to look at. It is a good note here that some aftercare services cannot be used while DCS is involved with a family or with the case. And so DCS actually has to have that case, such as family preservation, completely closed out. So just be aware that some resources out there, especially providers, that may be the case for them. Our last area of resources is definitely our very most weakest area when it comes to termination, and that is texting the customer satisfaction survey to the family. I would call it the family satisfaction survey. So it's a survey that's very brief and short. It's mobile friendly through a Google Doc, or actually I think it's a Google survey link. We want the skills coach and or the therapist and we want you to text that to the family, that link out. So letting them know, hey, I'm going to text you a link and it's for a survey. It's confidential survey. I don't have access to who fills out what, but this is for our quality department to be able to see, do we need to continue to work on increasing our care and the quality of our services? Because we want to help as many families as we can be able to stay together, and we want to help and we've worked on helping your family. So letting them know that the results are confidential, but then texting them that out as you leave or after you get to your car, sometime like that when they're still thinking about it and they know that it's coming. So that satisfaction survey in the last quarter of this training, when this training's been recorded, the last quarter we got one satisfaction survey out of 24 case closures. That's why I know this is a really weak area for us. And so I just wanted to encourage you to send that out so that we can continue to increase the quality of our services with families. Our next area for termination process is documentation. So for documentation, we have about 7 different things that we want to look at for steps of documentation when it comes to termination. So we'll start looking at those. The first is once you hear about a closure, and we've already somewhat covered this earlier, but we want to certainly obtain the closure date and the status of the case closure, being unsuccessful or successful. Now, if a case is 90 days or less, then that is considered by DCS early termination, and that's how we're going to mark our discharge status. But otherwise, we want to obtain from the FCM, are they marking it as a success or not? And that is usually going to be the skills coach or the supervisor who's collecting that information from the FCM. And it can be done very simply through an email or a text. Do not assume that DCS considers a case as successful if the children are still in the home. Sometimes they still mark it as unsuccessful because maybe the family didn't engage fully with services. They may mark it as unsuccessful. So make sure you get clearly what the closing status is of that case. We want our case closure status to match what DCS puts into Kid Tracks for their documentation. So it's really important to be able to collect that and get that from the FCM. Our second step is to create a closing case management note. And that would be the skills coach that's going to open up that case management note and put in the closing date and the discharge status of that case. Once they receive that in writing from the FCM, you can quote the FCM from an email. You could attach the email. That's not necessary, though. You certainly just want to have that final closing case management note. We do have to have that into our chart. Our next step is to close out the goals. So the skills coach will want to let the therapist know, hey, it's time to close out these goals. And we want to set their status as, did they achieve them or did they not achieve these goals? And so we want to go in and make sure we update all of those within the system. There's no other option between those two. I don't think there's any other option for goals. So it's, I think it's like in progress, achieved, or did not achieve. So we make sure that we close out those goals in each chart that as it closes. Even if it's an early termination chart, we want to make sure we go out and close those goals so they're not left open. Our next step is for the skills coach to email the OA that the case is ready for discharge. So then the OA is then able to go to our next step or at least wait for the DCS closing referral to come in with the closing date. Once the OA can still close out the chart without that, but at least the OA knows, hey, I need to close this chart out and this is the date. So, and then the OA is going to upload that DCS closing referral with the closing date into the chart. And that takes us to our next step. And that is the chart's status is going to be changed to discharge. And they're going to put in that discharge status, but also discharge reason. And then within 7 days, now this is newer information for me, within 7 days, DCS would like us to complete the monthly report 7 days from discharge so that they actually have that in kid tracks. I would guess they want it in time for court in case there's a court hearing where they need to be able to bring that data. So we want to make sure that we don't wait. Let's say it's the first that the case closes out. Oh, you got to do a monthly report even just for 1 day. Yeah, you do. So go ahead and get that done within 7 days. Otherwise, you're waiting till the next month, and DCS by that point's probably already needed the monthly report. And with that, of course, the monthly report, you want to generate that session summary with that monthly report, and that's the whole treatment team that's going to be working on that together. That wraps up some of the documentation steps. Now we're going to move into the last section of termination, which is going the extra mile. Well, I brainstormed at least 3 ways to go the extra mile, but there could be others as well. And it's definitely worth talking with your team to come up with other ideas of how you can exceed expectations, not only from DCS, but with the family as well. So one of those ways to go the extra mile is to, as an office, buy a box of thank you cards and during treatment team, pass around cards for the FCM of cases that just recently closed. And you want to make sure that you don't put any HIPAA information on it about the family. But if you put general information on that card, they'll likely know who you're talking about. The FCM will. But obviously, you don't want to put any identifying information on it. But passing those around during a treatment team and then being able to mail those to the FCM is just going above and beyond. Very rarely do FCMs get thank yous or gratitude. And so we want to be sure that a big spirit of our office and our services is that spirit of thankfulness. And what better way than to thank the FCM for letting us partner with them. Even if a case closed unsuccessfully, we still can send out a thank you to that FCM. It's just a great extra touch. A second way is a termination letter. These are pretty common in counseling clinics, but definitely something that we haven't been doing in the past through family preservation. In the Google Drive, there is a template. If you type in termination letter, that you'll find that's just a mock termination letter, kind of a template, all right, that you can type in your own information and make it your own and personalize that letter for the family that you worked with over the course of the case. You can print that either on just regular paper, or you could kind of go above and beyond and print it on some of our letterhead. And you can talk with your OA if you need help getting that printed off on letterhead. And they might even be able to do that for you, depending on how busy they are. Some of the things that you could put on that termination letter might be the number of sessions or meetings that you had together, the progress that you observed with the family, some additional resources that the family could turn to. It could be ones in your aftercare plan or even additional ones. And those could be further readings, videos, could be websites. There's all kinds of different resources that you could put in a termination letter. Overall, you can highlight their resilience that they showed, even despite some of the challenges that may have been there throughout the case. And definitely overall, you can express gratitude for allowing them to work with you, or allowing you, to work with them over the extent of the case. Seeking Safety, I believe, is one evidence-based program that also has as an option a letter that is read that talks about the client's strengths and their resilience. And that is something that a client can request from us at the end of working with them. So termination letter is very similar. The client isn't necessarily asking for it, but it is one way to do that. The other good thing about a termination letter is, even if the case closed abruptly, let's say, for instance, the case I shared where a guy went to jail, being able to send a termination letter is another way to be able to create closure with a family and to say, even though we weren't able to, and then fill in the blank, what I witnessed from you was, and then you can fill in those strengths and the resilience that you were able to see with the parent, with the family, with the children. And then our last step that might be able to be an extra mile is to do a follow-up text or a call or even a visit with the family after closure has happened, after a family has been discharged. It is acceptable. It is okay. So I've had that question where people go, can I still do that? One or two contacts after a session has been wrapped up with the family is perfectly fine. And some of our clients are going to reach back out to us just to see, to update us on what's happening, maybe to thank us. So those are some of the things that happen too with family preservation. So those are just three of many ways that you can go the extra mile. I'm sure there's way more. It might be worth talking with your team about what are some other ways that we can go above and beyond in working with our families. As we wrap up, I normally would take questions, but since this is a videoed training, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to your supervisor or to your regional manager or to your coworkers and talk with them further about some of the things that you've learned in this or the further questions that you might have. Take care.